Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 now of season 3 of A Conversation with Cometan. Today, I'm really excited to welcome a guest who I've actually spoken to last year for the first time, and it's Namrata Goswami. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. You can tell me later if I've not. And today, what I think the main topic of our conversation today, hopefully, will be space policy, maybe speaking a little bit about what's going on sort of in the space sector at the moment, because there is a lot of activity taking place as usual, and also maybe incorporating a little bit of religion and spirituality and philosophy in there as well, because of course, that is the theme of this series. So we'll see where the conversation goes. But like every guest that I have, what I first ask them to do is kind of just tell us how you got here, who you are, and kind of what your main areas of interest, but also study and work for us.
Sure, Cometan, thank you for having me today. It's a great pleasure and an honor. So a bit about myself. So I grew up in Northeast India, which is a remote area in the northeastern part of India, which is very close to Burma, China, and Tibet. And so growing up, as I referred to in one of my TED Talks, I was always inspired by the universe. So in a sense, in the area I grew up, because we had a lot of power cuts, we would see the sky very clearly, the night sky around the mountains. Oh, wow. So that was very inspiring to me. And I think my father, who was a historian, he was into music, classical Indian music. And so his library, which consisted of books on international relations, philosophy, both Western, Eastern, African philosophy, and then his books on the Second World War, colonialism, had a deep impact on me as a child. Wow. And so that background actually inspired me to study international relations. So I had a master's in political science. And then I went ahead and did a PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And for the last 20 years since I finished my PhD in 2006, what I've been doing is that I have been studying great power politics, especially China, India, the US. And within that context, I study space. So I look at the space policies of India, China, US, and also countries like the UK, UAE as well. And so today I have my own consultancy. I live in the US, in Alabama, which is a southern state. And also I am going to teach a guest master's program at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University. And so that's a bit about myself.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, isn't there? I suppose actually, let's start off with that because most people, when I speak to anyone who's involved in space, kind of start off with something similar, in childhood or in, their adolescent years. They, have this sort of this connection to the stars, this interest. And I think that differs for, who you are and has different degrees of intensity. I know that I've had a very sort of intense connection to the stars from mine was from about 15, so mine was a bit later, but it was very intense. So can you just kind of describe what you mean by that in a way? What was this kind of feeling that you had when you were looking up at the stars, and was it a purely secular one, or was it kind of mixed in with maybe spirituality and religion? Because all these questions that we have about, does God exist? Does the universe, how does the universe function and things like this? They're all connected. So maybe just start off with that, and then we can move into kind of the hardcore space policy afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, what was inspiring was the fact that we grew up in a household where we followed the famous Sanskrit slogan, which says that Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which means the world is one family and the universe is interconnected. And so because you grew up with such kind of oral conversations with your elders, with your parents, so because of that, I think the connection and the understanding that you have as a child, that you are actually, what you do in terms of actions has repercussions that is interconnected to the world. And so for me, that was a very significant part of growing up. And as I said, because I grew up in a very remote area, it's a small town called Haflau, which is pronounced Haflong because of the British. They mispronounced the name during colonial times. So Haflau means a small mountain in the local Dimasa dialect. And so the town basically is very uninhabited in some areas. And so you have a lot of interesting visuals of the sky. So by which I mean, unlike a city, when you live in a city, because of your electricity and power, your visuals of the sky gets polluted, right? Yeah. But when I was growing up, the stars would sparkle. And so we always wondered as to whether you're alone in the universe, whether there is interconnection across the universe. And so I would say that my philosophical and spiritual root can be drawn from that, from the way our parents conducted their lives and what they taught. And I think secondly, the concept of the universe being one family was deeply ingrained into my cultural background and belief system. So I would say there was a mixture of religion and spirituality that affected and created the person that I have become today.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I love to hear people's stories regarding that, because I think it's a really important origin. And of course, everyone who has this kind of similar feeling, we're all connected in that way. But also we contribute to the space community in different ways. I'm generally not involved at this stage in kind of actual space exploration or kind of engineering side of space exploration, although I'm very interested in that. I'm more interested in kind of the cultural sphere surrounding space exploration, but also as well what your speciality is as well, which is of course space policy. So I think that it's just interesting how we all have this similar feeling, we all have this sort of interest in space, but we all end up contributing in a unique way, and I really love that. So it's great to hear that we kind of come from, you know, that similar emotional, maybe even spiritual as well, origin, but it manifests in different ways. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. So let's move then into the core really of what of how this maybe connection to the stars, this interest in the stars manifested for yourself, which is space policy. Just for anyone who doesn't know, what does that term space policy encompass? What are the kind of topics that we're talking about with this? And also, of course, I presume most people understand who the main players are, but just could you give us kind of a brief, if you can, if anything can be brief in this area, but just kind of a brief overview of space policy right now, some of the main issues, I suppose.
Sure. So when you talk about policy, what is meant is that a plan that is developed by a particular organization or a society to basically reach some end goals. Yeah. So for example, if China has a space policy today, that would identify certain end goals that they want to achieve by a particular time period. And policy making is usually a pretty complex process. So especially in modern state systems, you involve the bureaucracy, you involve that particular organization that specializes not just in space rocketing, building rockets, but also in terms of financing. Where do you get the funds from? Why should taxpayers, especially in democracies, fund this particular program? So the rationale. And then why particular end goals are critical, both from a national security, prestige, space exploration, space inspiration perspective, right? And so space policy basically involves that particular multifaceted process. Now, some of the players that are critical today in terms of space exploration and development are, of course, the United States, which is the foremost country today in terms of space capability, having gone to almost all the planets and the furthest reaches of the universe. The second country that I think is critical is China today. Soviet Union was during the Cold War, but after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has very high space capability, but is lagging behind China today. Okay. So China is the second country, I would say, in terms of space capability, and they're building their capability very quickly in terms of being able to go not just to the moon, but also to Mars and beyond. India, which is another important spacefaring nation with the capability to launch, has missions to the moon and Mars and wants to extend it to studying the sun, go to Venus, and also talk about space resource utilization. Yes. Other countries, I think, which are critical players, the United Kingdom, for example, does have a very advanced space understanding and space policy. In fact, the UK in December was one of the leading players in the United Nations, basically putting forward the resolution to identify threats from space. For example, by that I mean space debris, which is a critical concern today. And so they actually got their resolution passed in one of the first committees of the UN General Assembly to study this particular concept. The UK also is investing in a concept called space-based solar power, which is the ability to get sunlight from space 24 hours. So UK is a critical player. Other countries, I think we should keep in mind are the United Arab Emirates with a space program today.
Yeah.
We have Japan, which is a very advanced spacefaring nation with launch capability. And what is interesting today is that unlike the Cold War, where you had two players, the US and the Soviet Union, today we not only have nation states, but we have private industry that is playing a growing role in space policy and space capability. So companies like Blue Origin, SpaceX, Marston Space, companies in China like OneSpace, LinkSpace are starting to build space capacity in terms of reusable rockets, Starlink satellite constellations, space tourism. And so it's a very interesting and very diverse world today, unlike the Cold War.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Yeah, and there's a lot of different players, and they have maybe similar goals, but maybe different intentions of how to get to those goals, maybe different methods, different standards, maybe. That's one of my main concerns that I did want to raise today because at the moment I'm doing my PhD in human rights, specifically religious freedom. But I'm interested in all kind of areas of human rights because they're all integrated. And one thing that I'm concerned about is how, China, but also to some degree Russia as well, how these nations are progressing in space, but other aspects of their policy are really regressing, particularly the human rights policy. So I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe understand how other types of policy in government can affect space policy. Do you know the degree to which that has happened, and is there any examples that we can kind of come up with as to how different branches of policy can really kind of affect space policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I look at space, me and my co-author, and I have the book right here so I can show it to your audience. Yes. We just published a book in 2020 called Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. So in that book, what we recognize in terms of our research over 3 years is that space policy does not exist by itself, as you were saying. Other policies affected, for example, the grand strategy of a particular state, national security considerations, also individual rights and human rights that you were mentioning, right? So one of the concern that I had highlighted in terms of the Chinese space program, which I study specifically, is that when we think about country China, we are really thinking about the Communist Party of China. Mm-hmm. So I think that important distinction always has to be made, because the decision-making process in China is not democratic. It's very authoritarian. And so, and also, as you have mentioned, there are human rights concerns in places like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, what's happening to the Uyghur population. So that's a huge, huge concern. What happened with Tibet historically, right? The Tibetan ability to independently and freely practice their religion is under growing concern with the Dalai Lama exile to India. So in that context, it's really critical to understand that when you're thinking about, for example, China is investing heavily in developing space capacity, but also investing in its ability to establish norms, which are behaviors in space. But then how do you see an authoritarian one-party system developing a particular normative regime that's not going to be that's not going to be inclusive in nature, right? Because the feedback mechanisms are very limited. Secondly, the biggest concern is that, let's take the example of the moon. So the moon is the size of Africa. Yeah. You do not have several areas that are rich in resources. You have probably the South Pole, where you have sunlight, you have water ice, you might also have other resources like iron ore, right? And so in that context, China is now partnering with Russia to establish a research station on the moon by 2036, which means it's a permanent settlement. And under the Outer Space Treaty, you are not allowed to have permanent stations, because that means you'll be infringing on the rights of others to get there. But China is already doing that. It's saying that this is not a national appropriation of territory. This is just a research station to study the resources on the moon. But then if you listen to the Chinese space scientists' argument, they're actually thinking about utilizing space resources like the lunar resources on the moon to establish the capability to become the most advanced space nation. Now, what happens if you have another country wanting to land in that area? For example, if India wants to land in that area, or UAE wants to land in that area. Now you have a permanent installation, you'll need permission. And international law today does not know how to handle that situation, right? We don't have the required updated space law to deal with that situation. So looking at China's behavior on Earth, for example, in the South China Sea, where once it laid claim to a particular island, it unilaterally declared that island a part of its territory. And when the Philippines, Indonesia and others raised issues about it, China turned around and said, no, this is our island. We've been there first. We were historically there to claim it. So you don't have a right to claim it at all. And what is interesting is that this is disputed. Now, my basic research opinion in this particular perspective is that we have to keep those other behavior in mind when you're thinking about China going to space or Russia partnering with China, right? And so these are issues that we are grappling with today, but I don't think we have the answers to it.
Yeah, and it seems not. And I was just going to ask you if I know that at the international level, it is still, as you just mentioned, we don't have the instruments at the moment to kind of deal with these things. Are those instruments being created as we speak? Is there any kind of behind the scenes that have not yet been published? Do we know of anything? Is there changes taking place? Are there policy advisors who are creating these kinds of instruments for implementation? Maybe at the United Nations, for example, is that taking place right now to deal with these issues?
Yeah, there is conversation that has started in the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, for example, and the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So, but they're only in the conversation level. So the way the United Nations functions is that we first introduce a topic either in the special committee dealing with space or the UN General Assembly First Committee. And then you have conversations around it, but then it has to be voted. And then it has to be also passed to become a resolution, and countries can dissent from it, right? And so what happens with regard to what is happening today in terms of space is that, And this is a shift that I think has not been recognized as much today, but it's people, I mean, societies are starting to recognize it, which is that space is no longer what it was during the Cold War, where space was limited to a rivalry where you had ideological battles happening. Today, space has become a part of our lives. You know, we depend on space for critical infrastructure, for example, satellite internet. When you use your GPS and move from one place to the other, you depend on 3 different satellites to support you. When you're transacting money, for example, e-commerce or your ATM transactions, they'll all fail if you do not have satellite support, right? And so during COVID, think of a situation where you depended on e-service and then it's off because somebody, either a space debris destroyed a particular infrastructure in space. So it's a very critical infrastructure today. So in that particular context, what the UN has started conversations on is that how do you manage the growing significance of space debris that can destroy space infrastructure? Is there a possibility to ban the destructive anti-satellite weapon tests, which the US and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War? China did one in 2007, India did one in 2019, and then Russia actually did one just last year in December.
Yeah, I think I heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that created a lot of debris in low Earth orbit, which is our access to such space infrastructure. But the problem, you know, Cometan, is that because you have these great powers and nations that look at space from a national security perspective, it is very difficult to come to a consensus as to a common understanding of what is allowed and what is not allowed. Nations are very wary that once you tie yourself onto a particular obligation, you will compromise your national security. And so I always say this to the space community. So one thing I think where there is a challenge and a disconnect is that when we talk about space from the space community perspective, we see it as a inspiration. We see it as people coming together. We see this as something that enhances us and makes us better than who we are, right? But policymakers and leaders have to also think about their national security considerations. And so, for example, China would be very wary to sign on to a complete giving up of its space capability to launch and attack infrastructure in space because of its insecurity with the US vis-a-vis conventional weapons. India's rationale for its ASAT test, which created about 400 pieces of debris in low Earth orbit, was that this is our defense mechanism because we are concerned about what China is doing. They didn't say it officially, but it was very clear that that's one of the concerns, right? And China says that it's investing in its military space capacity because it feels vulnerable with US space capacity, right? And so there is this interesting cycling loop that creates a huge challenge at the level of the United Nations. Yeah. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the United Nations represents states. Yeah. So it's a body made up of states that always want to represent their particular national interests. No matter how much pressure we bring onto it from the non-state sector, space community, nations will always vote in terms of their own interests unless there is great pressure within their own communities to change their behavior. And I don't see that kind of pressure today. There is a very limited pressure from academics, but the problem is that academics also don't tend to represent the entire universe. They represent their own small communities and universities. And so there is this disconnect.
Yes, and it seems as well, when you look at kind of the rationale side of space policy, that again, there is that disconnect. A lot of my time spent when I'm speaking about my philosophy of astronism in different speeches and things is reasons to go into space for religious reasons, philosophical reasons, spiritual reasons. This is what I spend my time, a lot of it, speaking about. But then if we do move over into the kind of space policy arena, we see that there's a lot of other reasons as well why countries want to go into space. Maybe as well, do you think that countries aren't maybe being as honest about why they want to go into space. I don't know. I mean, we know, of course, that there is huge amounts of potential for mining and things like that. That must be the main reason why they're going into space. Why would they spend all this money on space otherwise? I don't think they're just going because they have that kind of philosophical love for space like I do and like you do. Do you agree? Do you agree that that's probably the main reason? And also, are there any other kind of more, I don't know, do you think there's other kind of sinister reasons? I don't know, maybe weapons and things like this, you know, from the way we speak about countries, it seems to be that that's what it is. It seems to be money and and national security, which includes within that weapons, doesn't it? You know?
Yeah, that's a great question because you have to unpack so much. So when you look at human motivations, that's one of the most difficult area of study, right? And so when you look at yourself, you are also motivated by different values and ideas. And some might take priority, but then you also have others that subconsciously can affect you. So states are, after all, made of human beings. And so if you look at those who make policy, so one of the example I can give you is India, for example. Why is India going to space? So historically, India was interested in space primarily for the reason that they saw space as improving their own society's capability to deal with, for example, disaster. So if you have a satellite monitoring system, you can warn your society about whether, hurricanes or tsunamis that can affect your borders or your territory. And also, if you have good satellite support and that can forecast weather, you can help your own agriculture sector, for example. So one of the reasons for investing in space was that it builds your own internal national capacity. And I would think that countries like the US, China, Russia had that rationale as well, but might not be to the extent that India had it, right? They also looked at it from a very ideological attractiveness perspective. So if you remember the famous race to the moon in the 1960s, so because the Soviet Union was the first country to break the barrier and launch Sputnik in 1957, the biggest concern of the US was that now they can launch a nuclear weapon from space. So we need to be very, 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 very aware of that, was the argument. And secondly, we need to be somewhere first because we are looking like we are behind the Soviet Union. So what was the rationale and motivation there? Prestige. Right? So if your society is able to do something spectacular in space, you come across as innovative, technologically advanced, and the more attractive capitalist democratic idea vis-a-vis communism. Now, today, the rationale and motivation for, let's just talk about states. So why is China going to, for example, the moon or Mars? So if you look at their arguments, there are two reasons. One is that it showcases their capacity, for example, in terms of going somewhere and being able to go to the moon and Mars. And in fact, by landing on Mars last year, they were the second country to be able to do so. The Soviet Union tried, landed, but their rover failed to communicate. So it was not a successful mission. So that shows huge capacity on China's side. And I think what I find so intriguing about the Chinese argument is that most of their space scientists who are involved in their lunar and Mars program, as well as space-based solar power, is that they see space as an area where they can economically profit. So one of their main space thinkers argues that if you invest on the moon, for example, by 2050, you'll be able to get about $10 billion annually just by investing on mining, for example, and being able to use that to advance your own space capacity. So they've also calculated how much you can get from space. Another example is their Beidou navigation system, right? So when they invested in building the system, it was about $9 billion. And their navigation and satellite constellation division pointed out that you can actually annually get about $59 billion. So it's a huge economic argument why they're going to space. But then what is intriguing is that they also have their folklore. For example, the Chang'er, which is a moon goddess. So that is the name of their moon program. So now can you say that it's only about economy, or is it also the societal connection to the moon, the folklore that advances their idea? And so it's this combination of factors, right? And finally, I'll say that if you look at the US, for example, the primary motivation was, of course, ideological. But today you also have motivations like being able to establish a separate settlement, for example, on Mars. Like, right, if you listen to Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, their argument is that the Earth is finite in terms of its resources, especially Jeff Bezos makes this argument. So it is only rational and it's only correct that we are able to go and settle on space and take advantage of the resources there so that we do not run Earth out of resources. So again, it's a resources argument, right? Where it's an inspiration as well. So, I mean, many of the policymakers I talk to here are also inspired by science fiction. So Star Trek, Star Wars, 2001, A Space Odyssey. And so it's a very interesting combination.
Yeah, and that last point that you just made there really made me think as well about the environmentalist perspective, because they might have a problem with the idea of us going to other planets, using resources. And that's one of my concerns as well, is the environmental toll. And it's, I think, something as well that hopefully as time goes on and as space technology develops, that hopefully won't be as much of an issue. But right now, I think that maybe what we need to, I don't know, come to some kind of global consensus on is rules regarding what we can do on these planets when we actually reach them. I mean, I know I'm speaking more about in the sort of longer term future now, but things like terraforming and things like that, is the kind of space policy speaking about that, or is that too far in the head? Is that too science fiction for the moment? But it is like an environmentalist concern, I presume, and a climate change and a kind of sort of just a human concern, maybe.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, because one of the important lessons of history that we need to keep in mind as we become a more spacefaring. So the one point I'll make out is that we are not a spacefaring civilization, right? I think we have to start from there. So when we talk about space, it's so vast. It's billions and billions of miles, right? And so what we have only been able to do as a human species is to be able to go to low Earth orbit, which is not much, and to the moon, but we haven't been able to sustain any presence on the moon, right? So we were able to go there for 3-4 days, do some investigation and come back. So I think we also have to be a bit humble when you talk about space. So when we talk about space exploration, space development, mastery of space, it's really about being able to go to low Earth orbit, which is not much. It's the area around Earth, starts at about 100 miles to about 36,000 miles, right? And so beyond that, it's very difficult for us to sustain ourselves as well. Now, having said that, what I'm going to say is that the one thing, so we start from that point that we are not a spacefaring civilization as yet, but many of us, especially from the space community, those who are the space enthusiasts, they want to become a spacefaring civilization, right? So you have the different levels of civilization where you are not just using resources from Earth, but you're actually being able to use resources from space and develop yourself in another planet. So one of the main dreams of Elon Musk is to advance the 1 million city on Mars, for example, as you mentioned, by probably using terraforming. It's not a demonstrated concept as yet, but it is being simulated at the theoretical level today, right? Can we use terraforming to make Mars more habitable? Or can we use underground structures to live there? Or can we build habitats on the moon, which has been actually demonstrated on Earth by universities like Beham University, that advanced moon habitat concept. But I think, having said that, I would say that one of the lessons that we need to take with us is that, do we want to repeat the pattern of behavior that happened by the way we colonized and also advanced civilization in the past? Or have we learned lessons from that past and want to make sure that it's not repeated, right? Yeah. So for example, over exploitation of Earth's resources, lifestyle, the developed world's lifestyle is very intensive in terms of energy usage. Yes. And so those concerns are very clear, because there is scientists warning us that our planet is changing because of our lifestyles, right? The emission of carbon, gases into the atmosphere. So I think we need to keep all that in mind. Now, having said that, I'll also say that there is a counter perspective as well, which is that Earth and its nearby low Earth orbit is a very limited space we are talking about, right? But if we actually advance ourselves and are able in the future to go beyond our solar system by some advanced technology, we saw that in science fiction. Yeah. And so will we be able to get into a habitation system where we are able to have huge access to resources, which will not limit our development? We might be able to do it sustainably because we learned lessons from the past. We might have much more cleaner energy, for example, space-based solar power, which promises clean energy, renewable, and 24 hours. Will we actually develop systems and logistical systems that are based on renewable energy and not fossil fuels, right, on some other planet? And the sun is such an infinite source of energy as well. And so there are those who argue that you cannot limit human development and the aspirations that billions of us have to go to space, because you are so much taken by the climate discourse on Earth itself, right? And so it's a very complex argumentation system you have there. And so for me, I'm in support of space development and space exploration, but I'm also in support of doing it responsibly, and not repeating the problems of the past. For example, I come from India, and so because of that, I have seen the impact that colonial practices can have directly on a country, right, and making it impoverished. So we have to make sure that we do not repeat such examples.
Definitely, and I think that's why. I'm so passionate about space philosophy, space religion, because I think that we need to have these conversations. There's so many ethical, philosophical implications for going into space, so many unanswered questions that we need more space philosophers and thinkers generally to try to come together and answer some of these questions. And I think it'll take time to do that. Philosophy's been taking place for thousands of years. And so this is in some ways, a very old branch of philosophy, the universe, cosmology and things. It's existed for thousands of years, but not in the sense of us actually going out into space. People have wondered, what created the stars and things like that for thousands of years, but we've never had to think realistically about, how are we going to get to the stars, or what is it going to be like when we get there, and what kind of ethical codes are we going to take with us, So I think that just underscores the importance of space philosophy, which is a very new, it's still a very new branch of philosophy that doesn't have as much recognition yet as I would like. Hopefully that things are changing, especially within, our community of people who speak on the philosophical and religious elements of space exploration, not just the engineering side, because I think there's one branch of it where it's the engineering and technical and scientific side that discusses how we're going to get to space, but then there's this other side that says, well, why should we go to space? And the why of how, why do it in this way, things like that. So I think that just underscores that, but also as well, my kind of perspective is that I think if we're going to move, essentially what we're doing is we're moving and branching out from Earth, human civilization. So you're going to take human problems with you. So I think that, again, this is maybe sometime in the future, there might be a utopia at some point, I don't know. But for very much the majority of time that will be in space, there will be disasters, there will be suffering, there will be problems, there will be people who die. The people already have died from exploration in space. All we have to do is look back at the terrible tragedies that have taken in the name of space. But you also have to think as well about the actual endeavor of space. So I think, you know, when we look at those things, we have to remember that when humans go anywhere, we're going to take our problems with us. We want to try and reduce those problems as much as we can. We want to try and curb our greed and our our disregard for the environment that have plagued us in the past. But ultimately, we are humans, and you know, we are failed in our morality in that way. We're always going to be that way. So there will always be problems where humans are. So I think that's just a general fundamental principle, I think, maybe. But I don't think at the same time that should, you know, negate what we're doing in space. I think that should embolden us in a way to keep going, to keep this endeavor on track. And this is, again, I come across a lot of people in the work I do, just sort of common garden people, you know, they're not really involved in space like we are to that extent. They hear about it on the news, but they don't really understand why we're going. They don't really understand what the point of going is. So again, part of my job, but also yourself and anyone else involved in space, is education as well, is kind of trying to show people. And if you don't know the answers yourself, point them in the right direction to get those sort of answers about why space is important. And I have seen a lot of development, and I hope you have too, in the last couple of years, especially in terms of that area, sort of space education, space understanding, you know, of why space is important for our future, for the next generations and things like that. Have you seen that kind of improvement taking place in terms of sort of understanding of space, in terms of why we need to go?
Yeah, it's a great topic to discuss, actually. So yeah, as you said, in the last few years, maybe about 6 or 7 years, there is a growing conversation, right, as to why space is so critical. So historically, space has always been seen, as you mentioned, from ancient times with wonder. And societies have always studied the skies for so many things, including for navigation purposes, right? The whole New World was, the whole navigation of the seas depended on that. But the important point is that today I wouldn't say there is a vast understanding at all levels as to why space is critical. There is an understanding today because of work like people like you and others who've tried to project as to why space is critical in terms of human development, human philosophy, economic development, as you mentioned, and I agree with you that human nature, we can talk about spirituality and inspiration, but humans also care about whether they have food on their table, right? And so that's critical. If you do not have the basic needs met, one way by which you can deal with that very difficult situation is to be spiritual. And the other way is that you need your economic means of actually feeding your children. And I see that every day when I travel in India, in the remote areas. It's a struggle for life, right? And yet people look up to the stars in the night sky to be inspired. It's a very interesting juxtaposition. And so I think today there is a growing interest and understanding that space is important for our critical infrastructure, not just for military command and control, which was very much a part of the Cold War. Not just for a nuclear command and control. For example, in the Gulf War, you saw that space played a critical role. The first Gulf War in 1991 was the first time we saw those pictures on CNN where you had the missiles hitting each other, dependent on space support. And so that was the first time the military understanding of space came to the public eye. But I think the discourse is shifting from just military to economic perspective, and also a bit of the inspiration perspective, right? So I have noticed that even when the leaders of countries speak about space, they talk not just about national security, but they also talk about space contribution to everyday life. For example, a person in a remote area in India, for example, can sell their ware on the internet because they have satellite internet, right? And not fiber internet, which we depend on. And so it's starting to grow, but again, I would say that as you said, human nature is such that there will be a combination of motivations. So I'm reading this interesting biography on George Washington by Ron Chernoff, which talks about Washington's role in fomenting the American Revolution. And it was so hard. For example, I'm at that page where you're talking about Valley Forge, the famous camp that Washington developed, and hundreds of people died in those camps. Yeah. And it was not easy. There was no food, there was no clothing. And at times Washington himself was feeling very he was in despair because the Continental Congress would not fund the required clothing. And you can see those examples across history, right? During the colonial independence movement, Gandhi had to really rise his rhetoric and conversation and inspiration for people to actually then come forward, because there was also concerns about security and economy, right? And so I don't think we will become different if we go to space. Today, we have very limited access to space. I mean, 500 of us have gone to space. We are, billions of people. Yeah. So once we have 1 million, for example, if Musk's dream of establishing a 1 million city on Mars is achieved by 2075, let's take it as a scenario where they have done that, right? Yeah. Well, that would mean that you will have to establish a society, you'll have to establish rules, you'll have to establish a system of government. And then the key question, will you continue to be connected to Earth? Or will you start to break away, which happened with the New World, right? Yeah. Almost all the colonies broke away. Yeah. And so, it'll be very interesting.
I think from what Elon has said on that topic, I think he's thinking about breaking away and kind of having kind of maybe that'll be beyond his lifetime. I don't know, but by the time that happens, but this is why the subject is so interesting, because there is that sort of you can ponder on that, what will it look like in the future? And that's why I love this topic, of course. But I think what this, again, it comes down to these fundamental values and just going back a little bit to space policy and the kind of values we want to instill in space policy. One of them is definitely democracy and democratization. So this is something that I feel quite passionately about. I don't think we want to start off this really responsible endeavor, of space exploration. We have a responsibility to do this right for our future generations, because they're going to be affected by the types of decisions that are being made now. These decisions could have repercussions, hundreds of years down the line. We don't know. And I just wanted to get some idea from yourself about this idea of democratization of space. I have seen some organizations working towards this idea that, eventually anyone, no matter who you are, will be able to either apply to go to space or something like that, or every country at least will be able to engage with space exploration at some point, because of course the vast majority of countries still, they may have space agencies, they may have space organizations, but they've not actually been able to gather together the technology and funds to actually go into space yet. So I presume and I hope that this principle of democratization is being instilled, I hope, in space policies. I'm hoping so. Can you give us some kind of hope with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of my big, actually focus in terms of my research is how do you build a charter, for example? Every nation that is a democracy started with a particular declaration of intent, right? The American Revolution had a declaration of intent in 1776. India established a preamble in 1947. The UK has its own constitution, which is a very live document, right? And so you have to have a charter of intent. Now, when you come to space, this is not limited to just one country, right? Because if you're talking about the vastness of space, let's go beyond low Earth orbit to actually the moon and beyond, right? It's going to be a vast expanse of, a domain that will have several nations wanting to have a capability to get there. And as you correctly mentioned, today the access to space is limited to very few countries. Only a few countries have actually launched to space, humans to space. I'm not just talking about robotic or robotic missions, for example. So China is one country, US, Russia, India hasn't launched humans to space on its own. So very limited. And today with Musk and Bezos bringing down the cost of launch, Musk says that with Starship, the launch will be about $200 per pound and even lower. That means that all of us will probably have a chance once you have a mass production of that, right? And technologies have been that way. Like airplane tickets during my grandfather's generation were very expensive. They couldn't afford it. Today, almost all of us can afford some level of plane travel, right? Because it's come down in terms of price. So in that context, what I think is critical for the future of space is that, first of all, you bring down the cost of launch, you give access to people all across the world and not just state-funded astronauts. Today, when we talk about astronauts, we always prioritize NASA astronauts or Russian cosmonauts, right? But you have to go beyond that. You have to have common human beings who do not have those physical capabilities that can go to space, because it's very exclusionary. You have to be physically capable. Your eyesight has to be perfect. You see what I'm saying? It's like pilots, and it's required. But you have to transcend that to make it actually truly democratic. Now, so in that future, I think it is critical that democracies are the one in the lead, exactly for the reasons you're mentioning: inclusiveness, human rights respect, accountability, responsibility. No matter how much we get frustrated with democracies, we still have a free press, or we are able to hold governments accountable to the level we can. We're able to express our opinions when we dissent and not fear that we will be silenced or jailed, right? So if you have a space future where democracies are in the lead, you can hope that that future of space access and space development will basically revel in democratic principles that would give access to those, not just with economic capability, but also with a system of governance and organization that is able to include different perspectives and capabilities, right? Now, an alternate future is that you have a space future that is led by authoritarian governments where dissent is absolutely not allowed. And some of the functionaries of the Communist Party of China behaves like that. If you have dissent, either you are disappeared or you are not heard of again, or you apologize in public for your perspective, right? It's unthinkable in the US for me to say something and the government coming and saying, you need to apologize publicly, right? So, there'll be some level of process that will hold the government accountable. India, there will be a similar process. Japan, to a large extent. The UK, I hope it's the similar case, that when you make an opinion,
I think so, yeah, I hope.
Yeah, right. So, and so in that context, it's really important that we actually develop a system that is democratic. But how do you achieve that? You will have to establish a charter or a declaration of principles that highlight that. I know that several non-governmental organizations are working on establishing a charter, for example, to make space resource utilization democratic. The Hague Working Group is working on that. You have university-led, perspectives that want to build that future. But I don't think it's at the level of mass consumption as yet. Yeah. And I think we are in a critical moment today, Cometan. It's today that we'll have to establish that particular preamble, if I may, a democratic preamble that can be then put out through the UN or through another body that ensures that nation states investing in space in the next 40 years, even after we are gone, are adhering to those principles, right? And so that's a way forward, but we do have a challenge. International law and international obligations are so hard to enforce. Who's going to enforce those principles? You don't have an international enforcing mechanism. So we have to work through all that.
Yeah, and again, that just underscores as well that we are still very much at the beginning of this journey into space. And I think that as well connects to one of the final topics that I wanted to just address today. And I hope you'll come back as well, because I really want you to. It's been a great conversation, and I hope that we can have a second one at some point when we're both free. But is the new telescope, which is the James Webb Telescope, and I'm not sure how much you're involved with that type of that particular topic of more astronomy rather than space, but it is still, space exploration, of course. And I think from what we could understand from this new telescope, it's so exciting what the types of information that we hopefully will receive, maybe the images as well that we will receive. That again, it just underscores, doesn't it, how we're so much just at the beginning of this endeavor. This telescope has taken 20 years or so to bring about, and that's just one telescope. Me and you have been talking about huge endeavors today. We've been talking about moving parts of humanity to other planets and things. So it just underscores, doesn't it, what a momentous task that this is going to be, but at the same time how individuals and organizations can be really and everyone who's contributing to this are playing an important role.
Well, yeah, I think the James Webb Telescope is going to improve humanity's understanding of how the universe was formed. So that's one of their goals, right? So once you build that huge mirror, which they're in the process of building, and I think if I remember right, NASA pointed out that they'll be able to offer us the first image from the telescope by May of this year. And so there are two things that James Webb Telescope will help us much more, is that we'll have a better understanding of how galaxies are formed, for example, because when you talk about space exploration and space development and going beyond your solar system, you also have to have knowledge as to how these particular galaxies were formed, how stars were formed, what happened a million years after the Big Bang, for example, right? And so the James Webb Telescope promises to be able to peer into that distant past and give us, at least through astronomers and through scientists, to give us more information about how the universe actually formed. And then I think the most exciting for those who are looking at this from a space development, space travel, in the distant future, is that it will also study exoplanets.
Yes.
So, which is a great, interesting new domain of astronomy and science. And so we'll have an understanding of whether they are like Earth, if they have any kind of resources, water. So it'll give us some understanding of, and also forward the already existing understanding of exoplanets. So I think it's a very, very, very good development for understanding space much more at the common level.
Yeah, and I think also it just as well underscores the importance of some of these principles that you've highlighted: democracy, freedom of speech, things like this, human rights, as we've spoken about, as well, so that governments are held to account when they're interacting with scientists as well. I don't want to generalize about scientists, but generally they're not involved in the political realm. They're involved in they want to be involved in the research, especially astronomers. They spend a lot of time in observatories on their own, and people who aren't involved in other aspects of things. So I think obviously they have a love for what they do. So I think as well, it's just important going forward that we kind of protect them from the politicization of space, to make sure that we always separate the knowledge we have about space and keep that away from, if we can, I know it's difficult, it probably won't happen, it's just an ideal, but keep that away from being politicized, being manipulated by governments who maybe don't like some of the information that is coming out about what scientists are doing. And again, we see this, I think just this week, where there's been an infiltrator in the UK government, and from a Chinese infiltrator, I think, and there've been sanctions that have been placed from either side on academics who've been speaking about this. So it just underscores some of those fundamental values, doesn't it? And I think that can be sort of the lesson from this conversation, really, is that hopefully going forward in space policy, we'll be able to list some of these really fundamental values and implement those. So just a final roundup, really, from some of the topics we've spoken about. What are the things at the moment that you are really involved with, and especially this year? What are some of the things that you've been looking at in space policy and upcoming projects for yourself, just so then people can get excited for some of the things upcoming?
Absolutely. So one of the projects that I'm involved in is to understand even more deeply as to how space policy is actually formulated, right? Okay. So, for example, me and you, we could say we are in the epistemic community, where we talk about ideas, ideals, values, or particular end games, right? Now, once you have that conversation, what is required for some of your value systems to actually make it to a policy organization? Now, who is the policy organization you need to interact with? For example, you talked about scientists. I agree that sometimes, because they are so much involved in their research, that the strategic part of getting into policy making, informing the right policy, can be something that scientists might not want to get involved with because it's time consuming and administrative and boring, but you have to do that, right? So that's a project that I'm working on, a continuation of the kind of work we did in our book, where we looked at how space policy proceeds from epistemic conversations to actual policy. And once it makes it to the policy document, how does it get funded? Funding is critical and important, right? And I think the one lesson I would like to put forward in terms of one of the projects I'm doing is also understanding how countries' strategic culture influences their space behavior. Yeah. So we tend to see countries as having a common inspiration to go to space. But as you and I discussed today, that's not always the case. And in fact, is not the case, right? Countries have different motivations for going to space, and countries would include their citizens that are involved in space activity. So one of the projects that I'm working on today is a book on the strategic culture of China. So what is China's strategic culture? What is their political philosophy and culture today? Does historical philosophies have an impact? And today, under President Xi Jinping, what are their priorities, right? And so space is one of their critical priorities, but why? And so that's an exciting project, because to dissect the why is important. I'll end by saying that one of the concerns I have, and I'm starting to write on this, is that I think we really need to think about a ban on anti-satellite weapon, which you talked about, weaponization of space, right? So space is already militarized today. You have space that you use space infrastructure for military activities. We still do not have weaponization, but you have anti-satellite tests that have destroyed their own satellites and created debris. Now, why I'm concerned about this is that the more debris you create, the more obstacles you create for access to space. It's dangerous if you have debris flying at that speed on low Earth orbit, can hit another satellite, can hit a rocket and create catastrophe, right? The International Space Station had to maneuver several times because of the debris created by the Chinese anti-satellite test in 2007. It's a dangerous field there. So I think I'll end there by saying that I think the first step we need to take is, first of all, create a preamble as to how to make space democratic. And second, if we can come to a consensus via the United Nations to have a ban on anti-satellite tests, that will be a great service to humanity.
That's brilliant. Yeah. And I hope that that's what will happen, and hopefully people will be working towards that. And it's just such a fascinating topic. And I've loved speaking to you today. So we'll end it there. I hope that you'll come back and we'll have another conversation, hopefully in the future, on similar things. Hopefully things may have progressed a little bit with some of these topics by then, and we can discuss those. And I will now sign off, and we will see everyone else in the next video. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Namrata, today for your conversation. Thanks very much. It's been great.
Thank you for having me.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.